Hi, welcome back to the Garden Benchtop. Today I've got a really exciting tutorial which I've been keen to share with you. We are going to be making a self-watering moss pole. That's right, with this moss pole you don't need to worry about misting it, keeping it hydrated, because this moss pole is going to have a water reservoir that is going to wick water and keep the sphagnum moss that we're going to be putting in it nice and moist for you. In this case, I'm going to be installing a moss pole for this Monstera. You can see this Monstera is desperately in need of a moss pole, and there are reasons why I believe this Monstera would really benefit from a moss pole. And I've detailed all those reasons in another video, which I'll put a link in the description below and in the top right hand corner. I'm really keen to get this Monstera deliciosa onto a moss pole because ultimately I'm looking to get these leaves matured with those fenestrations that we all love. I'll show you how to install a moss pole for Monsteras in a separate video. This video is purely about building out the moss pole. As you can see, these are the materials that you're going to need. We're building out our moss pole with sphagnum moss. I love sphagnum moss. It is ultimately one of my go-to growth mediums on a moss pole because it just retains so much water and it's easy for the aerial roots to penetrate and get an anchor onto. You're going to need a PVC piping with an end cap. Now that's the important part, an end cap, because this is going to form the structure of the moss pole and the water reservoir is actually going to sit inside the PVC piping. So this end cap needs to be watertight. I've got two here because ultimately you need to choose the length yourself depending on the plant. I'm probably going to go with the longer PVC piping just because it'll give my Monstera ample room to grow as it matures. You're also going to need craft rope. So craft rope is made from cotton, and cotton's a great material to use because it allows the water to slowly wick up the rope and down into the sphagnum moss. For the outside structure of our moss pole, we're going to be using gutter guard. You can use any form of material here. I've seen some people use wire mesh. I've seen some people use bird netting. I like to use gutter guard because it's still quite strong, but we don't need any special materials to cut it, and it's already cut into certain lengths, so all we need to do is chop the right length. To keep everything together, you'll need some cable ties. I personally like longer ones just because it helps when you're threading it through and tying everything together, but it's ultimately your choice. And finally, just going to need a sharp knife, preferably clean, so that we can cut the gutter guard. At the same time, a sharp pair of scissors will also work for this. Okay, let's get started. Now, if you haven't already measured up your PVC piping, get that sorted. So what you want to keep in mind is that this PVC piping is going to sit towards the bottom of the pot. So when you're measuring it up, you want to see how deep the pot is, but also you want to see how high you expect your plant to grow. I went with 1/2 meter. This will give ample room for the Monstera to grow without me having to replace this moss pole anytime soon. And once again, like I said at the start, make sure that the end cap is watertight. Otherwise you'll have water leakage issues and your soil will become quite soggy. Okay, the next step is to cut our craft rope to the appropriate length. What we're going to be doing is threading this cotton rope down the center of this pipe. And what I like to do is tie a little ball and knot down the bottom just to give it a bit of weight and anchor it. And what that's ultimately going to do is sit down at the bottom. Now this is really important so that the craft rope stays at the bottom. What you want to do is splay out the ends and fit the end cap on top. And what this effectively does is lock your rope down the bottom so that it can't float up to the top. And now what we want to do is coil this rope all the way down to the bottom. So once you've got that coiled down, you just simply want to cut it off and tie it off. There we go. a coiled PVC piping. The next step is to measure our gutter guard. Now, when you're taking the measurements for the gutter guard, it's going to reach from the top of the PVC piping, or maybe just below, all the way down to where the top of the soil line. So that's roughly going to be around here. So let's cut that. Now we're going to need 2 pieces of gutter guard because we're going to join both pieces and essentially envelop the PVC piping. Okay, so there are your 2 pieces of gutter guard. Now what we need to do, we're going to form a cylinder with these 2 pieces of gutter guard. But to do that, we need to attach one end first, which we're going to use the cable ties for. So essentially what you want to do is line up your 2 pieces of gutter guard so they overlap. And we're going to continue zip tying all the way down at intervals of 1.5 inches, just so that we don't have any gaps for the sphagnum moss to fall through. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut these off and then get our sphagnum in there. So to cut zip ties, I like to use sharp scissors rather than a blade. Blade can sometimes slip and you can cut yourself, so I opt for the scissors. Now that we've got the exterior of our moss pole ready, let's get our sphagnum moss ready by pre-moistening it. So when using sphagnum moss, it's always a bit of a guessing game to how much we need to use because it will soak it up and expand a bit. I've used about a good 6 to 7 handfuls here, but we don't want to get it too sopping wet. We just want to get it moist enough so it's easy to work with and we can lay it down nicely. Pour in a bit of filtered water. Toss it around, make sure that all the bits of the sphagnum moss are able to absorb some water. Okay, so we'll let that sit for a couple of minutes. In the meantime, let's start getting the next steps ready. So just to explain, we're going to be laying the sphagnum moss down here, putting our pole into the center, and then we're going to be encasing it. If you have a look at the diameter of this, we've got a PVC piping is going to go in the middle, so it's going to need to be about 1 inch in thickness. The things to keep in mind when you're laying your sphagnum moss down is you don't want it to be too dense. If it's too dense, the aerial roots of the monstera will have difficulty penetrating and anchoring into the sphagnum moss. Plus, it'll make it difficult for water to be evenly distributed around the moss pole. So you want it to be dense enough so that there's no gaps, but not too dense where you won't be able to poke your finger. Now this is going to be the top of our moss pole. So if it's a bit light on, that's okay, because we can always tuck a bit more sphagnum moss in at the top. It's really the center that you want to make sure there's no gap. Now what we need to do is lay our piping on. Here comes the tricky bit. If you've got someone around the house to help you, it makes it a lot easier. Unfortunately, it's just me at this time, so this may get a little bit messy. So what you want to do is lay down the piping in the middle, get a zip tie ready, and we're going to try and enclose this. So the tricky thing about this part is getting the zip ties in and up the holes. And what I find helps is using a pencil to leverage it up. So I'm going to continue going down at different intervals and finish off this moss pole. Okay, so as you can see, it was a little bit of a struggle. You would have seen me adjusting the density of the moss within the moss pole. It's a hard thing to balance. Essentially, you want to have as little gaps in there as possible, but you don't want to make it too dense so that you can't thread the zip ties in. So now all we need to do is cut them off. And after you've cut them off, what I recommend you do is try and turn these around so that the sharp edges are not on the outside. Alternatively, you can get some sandpaper and sand them down. So essentially, you now have a self-watering moss pole. So what I would do is just top off the top with a bit more moss. But how you use this moss pole now is, rather than moisten the moss, all you need to do is fill up the water reservoir with water. Top it up every time you water your plants. But essentially, this cotton rope will wick all the water down the coil and keep all this sphagnum moss in this moss pole moist, so that your monstera or other climbing plants will have plenty of moisture to absorb. There you go, a self-watering moss pole. Thanks for following along on this tutorial. If you found this helpful, please hit that like button, and as always, subscribe to our channel so that you can be updated with more helpful tutorials like this one. As we always say at the garden bench top, go get your hands dirty.